Today we're continuing on with this love story, the Song of Songs, where two become one. We're continuing not only to go verse by verse, but we're continuing it in our lives, where we're writing the story of how He's gaining us and we're gaining Him, and the two are becoming one. Last time in verse 13 we got to see that her beloved was a bag between her breasts, and this was denoting Him as presently with her as the indwelling one, whom she appropriated and apprehended by faith and love, and He was with her all through the night indwelling. We continue on with verse 14 today, and she begins by saying, "My beloved is to me as a cluster of campfire in the vineyards of Engedi." She continues on with this wonderful phrase, "my beloved." She said "my beloved" in verse 13. Now she says "my beloved" in verse 14. As lovers of Christ, we never get tired of calling Him our beloved, the one whom we love beyond all others. On one hand, in His person, He is so full of love. He's the initiator of our love. But on the other hand, we respond to Him with love. He is our beloved. And as we repeatedly call Him and tell Him we love Him, this would be like in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, it says, "How much God has prepared, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, nor has it come up into man's heart, how much God has prepared for those who love Him." Let us love Him and tell Him that we love Him continually. "You are my beloved." This is a phrase that the Father had repeatedly said to Jesus. This is my beloved Son. He was the supreme one to the Father. And today, this wonderful bridegroom is the supreme one to us, the preeminent one, the one that we love more than anyone else. And He is. She says, "My beloved is." It's a present love. It's not a past love. It's not something she hopes in the future, but it's continual. It's present. It's unbroken. And she says, "My beloved is to me." Again, she repeats this phrase, "to me," in verse 13, "to me," and in this verse, "to me." This means that she is personally involved with Him. It's not something she's heard or something that's been passed on to her, but she's appropriating, she's gaining Him, and she's fallen in love with Him. So she says, "He is supreme. This is the one. This is who He is to me." In Isaiah 9:6 it says, "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given." It's unto us, but even more in this verse, it's unto me. He died for me. He lives in me. He is for me, for me, for me. And He is, to me, a cluster. This is the same word, cluster, that is used when the spies went into the good land in Numbers 13. And they had a cluster of grapes. It was full and manifold. And this is a picture of Christ. He's a cluster. In the last verse, He was a bag. He was a fullness. In this verse, He's a cluster, denoting the manifold graces of Christ. There's many graces in Him, many attributes, many virtues, many riches in Christ. All the perfections of divine and human, of what is divine and what is human, are in Him. Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9, he says, "the excellencies of the one." He uses this plural word, excellencies, or virtues, or praises of the one. In 1 Timothy 3:16, Paul says, "God was manifest in the flesh." When you saw this person, there was something so excellent about Him. In the Gospels, the disciples following Him, said, "No one has ever spoken like Him." He is so excellent. There's so many excellencies about Him. And this cluster to us is as we live Christ. There's a cluster in our life. There's a cluster upon us. This cluster was a bouquet or a bunch of flowers that were like a cluster of grapes, and that's why some versions translate this a cluster instead of a cluster of campfire. They say a cluster of grapes. But this is something that he is to us. It's not something he gives to us. He doesn't give us a cluster. He doesn't give us this or that. But he himself is to me a cluster. In Titus chapter 2, there were slaves there, and Paul instructed them what were they to do before their masters. They were supposed to take care of the work of their masters. But even more, there was a teaching that brought the reality of Christ into their lives. And they were to take this teaching as their adornment, as their ornament, as their clothing. They were to adorn this teaching. As slaves to their masters, the masters can see a cluster of flowers, a cluster upon these slaves. How about us during our daily life? Is there a cluster in our life? Is there something that gives evidence that Christ is real? Sometimes we say, read the Bible, and you'll see how real Christ is, and it's very true. But at other times, the Bible is not available. What is available? We are living proof. We are living evidence. There is an excellent Christ. We are proof of the excellencies of Christ. And this is a cluster of campfire or camphor. Another word for camphor, they use henna or cypress. And this is a small shrub or tree with fragrant creamy white or golden red flowers that are very scented. And the word camphor here is, like I said, it could be translated campfire, henna, cypress, and it depends if in Hebrew or the Arabs they translated it differently. But these were the flowers that the women would wear. The cluster of campfire would be a cluster of flowers that the women wore to adorn themselves. And like I just said, we're wearing Christ in his loveliness. Wherever we go, we give evidence to the loveliness of Christ. In Romans chapter 13, Paul says, put on Christ. In Song of Songs 113, Christ is dwelling within us. No one can see him. He's just so rich in the fellowship. But in this verse, Christ is not only within us, he's without us, he's upon us. He's our clothing. In fact, some versions, instead of say putting on Christ, they say be clothed with Christ. Christ is our clothing. Christ on one hand is our clothing before God. He's our righteousness. But before man, we have a testimony. We give evidence to the riches of Christ throughout our daily life, the way we carry ourselves. The root word of this word sapphire or henna, the root word comes from the word ransom, or a price that was paid for another life. And this is in Exodus 21. Also, this word also is translated pitch, as Noah, when he was making the ark, the word pitch that he used to seal the ark from the inflow of waters, this is the same word. So when the world was under the judgment of God's condemnation, the waters of judgment were coming. What kept the waters of judgment out was this pitch. In the same way, this word campfire is used as propitiation. We're wearing Christ. We're clothed with Christ. We bear the testimony, the evidence that we have been redeemed. This henna flower was used for cosmetics. Some of the women would take this and make dye to put on their fingernails or toenails So whether we have the flowers or we use the dye, our hands bear the testimony that they are no longer for use of the world. We are not our own. We belong to Him. Our feet bear this dye. We don't walk where we want to walk. You can see the bride beginning to become possessed by Christ, gained by Christ. Inwardly, He's a bag diffusing His suffering and His death. Outwardly, she bears a testimony that she's clothed with Christ. The bouquet of flowers or the fingernail dye just gives a testimony and evidence. This one is different. She belongs to another. And this cluster of henna flowers can be found in the vineyards of Engedi. The vineyards, we've seen this word before. There was keepers that tried to make her keeper of other vineyards, and she said, I did not keep my own vineyard, but others were trying to distract me. But here is the place of the vine, and these vineyards are there expressing Christ. So she is among others who are bearing a testimony that Christ is everything. And this is found in the place of Engedi. Where is Engedi? Well, the word Engedi means, firstly, en or ain means a spring or a fountain. Engedi means kid or a goat. So she's found in the place of the fountain spring or the kid spring. And this was a place that David would flee to in the wilderness. It's in the southern Palestine. It's near the Dead Sea. And he would flee to this place when pursued by Saul, and he would find a place of refuge there. It's a place for the rejected. In the vineyards of Engedi, there's a fountain, there's a spring, there's a kid or goat, and this is where we find refuge. It would be as in the Pentateuch, where there was the cities of refuge, where we could flee to and not be judged. Where do we flee? We flee to Engedi when we're rejected. Where do we flee? We flee to Christ. He's the place. He's the place where we go to when people pursue us. When things pursue us to try to distract us or hurt us, or misunderstandings come to us, we go to Engedi. What is in Engedi? There's a fountain there. Okay, there's a famous song by Cowper. He says, there is a fountain filled with blood drawn from Emmanuel's veins. This kid, this goat, was slain. And this slain lamb is just Christ. He was slain. And now there's a fountain. His blood is flowing out. This is where we find refuge. This is where we go to when we're rejected. We go to the blood of Christ that is flowing out. This is where we find rest and peace. Also, this fountain is of life. It's of the Spirit. Because Christ was crucified, because His blood was shed, now we can receive the Holy Spirit. The Spirit can be our inner cleansing, our inner supply. We can be in the vineyards of Engedi as a cluster of henna flowers, giving evidence. Even though we've been rejected by the world, yet we wear Christ. We display Christ. We exhibit Christ. We're evidence. We're people that are believers, are evidence that Christ has died. We're evidence that we're not like the world. Isn't it good to be a testimony, a witness of this wonderful Christ? So in summary, I'd like to say this. These three verses, verses 12, 13, and 14, each one of them bears some fragrance. In verse 12, it bears the fragrance of nard, or spikenard. In verse 13, it bears the fragrance of myrrh. And in verse 14, there's the fragrance of the henna flower. When Adam fell, There was no fragrance. In fact, it was a stinking situation. There was not a good smell. To be apart from God, without God, apart from Christ, there is no good smell. The scent is terrible. It's an odor. It's not good. But in these verses, in verse 12, while the king was sitting at the table, supplying, giving out all of the riches of who he was, she responded. There was a fragrance that came out of her through the supply of the king. And she consecrated herself. And the place was filled with the spikenard, the smell of consecration, the smell of love, the smell of her becoming one with her king. Then in verse 13, she goes on to say, my beloved, he's within between my breasts. I'm appropriating him by faith, by love, and he's a bag of myrrh, diffusing this fragrance of his suffering and his death, that within me there would be nothing that competes with him, that nothing that resists him, nothing that would take his place, that he could become my all in all. She consecrates, and he begins to work within her all through the night, all through the dark time. Then in this verse, not only is he the supplier in verse 12, not only is he the indwelling one in verse 13, but he's her clothing. She wears him as a bouquet, covered with the flowers, the henna flowers found at the place of rejection. She is so absorbed with Christ, and he is pouring himself into her that she bears such a wonderful fragrance. Isn't this wonderful? As the two become one, we become fragrant as he is fragrant. In fact, this henna flower, it will be seen in chapter 4 again, where she is a garden growing henna flower. She's become so full of him that she's growing him out to others, where others can see Christ and enjoy Christ as she enjoys. So finally, I like to say in this verse here, in verse 14, there's such a revelation of Christ. He's the beloved. He's the one full of love and causing her to love. Christ is a cluster to her, full of excellencies, full of moral virtues, full of divine virtues, full of divine attributes, human virtues. He's a cluster. Who is this Christ? He's the henna flower. He's the one who paid the price, the ransom price for us. And we bear him. We're evidence that the work that he did can be seen in our lives. Who is this Christ? He's our refuge, where we find a fountain of blood that he shed and a fountain of water for our thirst, our strengthening, that we can become like him, be transformed, to be made like him. So let us pursue this one. We love him so much, and let us write more and more of him into our being. As he loves us, we love him, and as the two become one, and the song continues to be written in our lives.